I would describe it as ethical wealth building. You described it as redemptive capitalism. Was that the term you guys used?
Yeah. I like your phrase.
I love that. Yeah, ethical capitalism, redemptive, and then we're trying to avoid. Would you say the cutthroat capitalism, or what was the other?
Ruthless capitalism.
Ruthless capitalism. Okay, I love that. So now let's segue. I want to talk about this. I feel like when it comes to social issues, right, social justice, it doesn't take much to look out into the world and to say, hey, in America, things aren't equal, right? Like there's not equality. People are treated different. We don't have to dig super deep. I mean, the math is fairly obvious. And what I see is again, we see two different extremes, right? We see one extreme that says, oh man, the people are if people complied, if people behaved better, if people made better choices, right? If they had better skills, if they had then they would do better. Then they wouldn't succumb to being a victim of police brutality or a victim of violence, right? And then the other extreme would say things are unfair, therefore we need to redistribute the wealth, right? And I don't know where exactly you guys fall on this. And so one extreme, the fear for those folks that lean right would be, hey, the worst thing you could possibly do is label somebody a cultural Marxist, right? That's the worst thing you do. And then people on the left, the very worst thing you could do is to label somebody a fascist or a racist, right? Like that's like you tell somebody they're racist and it's like, oh, it's lights out. And you guys are both entrepreneur. You guys are both capitalists, ethical capitalists, kingdom capitalists, right? And we're also against ruthless capitalism. We're also against just a Darwinism, survival of the fittest mode. Right. How do we reconcile these ideas? Because I think we would agree. I hope we would agree that a lot of our solutions to these issues are going to go back to empowering people and helping them develop revenue streams, as well as punishing legislatively when something does go awry. And we can get into the particulars of stuff, but I think it's really ironic because both sides act like they have a monopoly on facts. It's just like none of us got a monopoly. Like there's truth to both degrees. If KB makes $20 million next year, I don't think you should get charged 70% taxes from the Green New Deal. I think that's unethical. I think that's wrong, right? To say, hey man, you made 10 million, Green New Deal. I want 70 million. I want 70% of that, right? So that would be like, yo, that sounds a bit extreme. We're literally just taking stuff. And then the other side, is like, hey, well, we need to care for people.
I want you to ask your question, Ruslan. So be ready to watch. But I do think I want to have a good answer when I stand before God of why I needed $20 million to live, though. Now, I'm not saying having $20 million is wrong at all. Don't hear me saying that, guys, please. But I do want to stand before God where my money means nothing. And I want to have solid answers.
Yeah.
Why I kept as money as I did. And that's the kind of question I'm asking myself now, because I have $20 million in the bank. I was
going to say, well, here's the deal, though. Here's the deal, KB. I would much rather you have $20 million and you invest that back into your businesses and you give that to the local church plants and you give that to the charities than for the government to have 70% of that and be completely irresponsible and inefficient with it.
Hey, I am all for a restrained government. So, no, I wasn't countering you at all, but that did make me think about that. But go give me your question, though.
So the question is,
I agree with that, for sure.
The question is, we're divided as a country, right? Okay. When it comes to this, and I call myself politically agnostic. I'm not voting for either of the candidates. I've went on record about that. I have a conflict of conscience with voting for either them, and I think it's honestly, I think it's an old barbaric system we have here with a two-party system in general. Wow. But what we're dealing with is there are going to be people that whenever, and I get like my Reform brothers that literally anytime I say anything about Black Lives Matter, the sentiment like, hey, this isn't fair, this shouldn't have happened. Hey, you're pushing cultural Marxism. By the way, you're a critical race theorist, just so you know. Go ahead. Right. You're pushing cultural Marxism. You're pushing intersectionality. You're pushing critical race theory. You're pushing all these things. And it's like, fam, I'm pushing what I feel is biblically reflected in the scriptures when it comes to how we are to treat those who have endured injustice under this system. And we can get into the particulars on stuff. My question to you is, how do we attempt to bring people together? And I think you do a good job of this, KB, because I feel like you guys are very unapologetic when it comes to social issues, but you're also very unapologetic when it comes to your faith in Jesus and you guys being business owners and that. So like, how do we reconcile these points? I know it's an election year. I know everything is politicized, but how do we reconcile these 2 points of view to say, listen, if you're a Christian, Black Lives Matter is not a political statement, it's a biblical one, because all lives can't matter and Black lives can't matter, right? Like how do we reconcile that and communicate that so that those of our brothers and sisters that are on the right can hear us, and at the same time also say, hey, yeah, we're not for communism, we're not for like complete redistribution of wealth and and Marxism, because I'm not a Marxist. Like, I come from Soviet Russia. Like, communism is not lit, socialism is not lit. Yeah, I know. I remember the ration lines. Like, I remember lining up to get bread. I remember having a tub of water that we had to have us last for like a few days or maybe even a week, and we used to have to like ration that off amongst our family. That was the only water we could use. So I remember growing up in it. I don't think that's where we need to go as a country. I'm not saying we're going there as a country, but I don't think that's the solution, right? So how do you guys reconcile these things as entrepreneurs, Christians, and men of color who see this and maybe feel it firsthand? It's a little different when you know, like, you've experienced police brutality, or like, I know I've been to 7 funerals. 2 of them were of unarmed Black men killed by police. Like, this hits me different. You know what I mean? I've seen it. I've been to the funerals. I've seen it. I understand. I've seen the footage, and I'm like, yo, this doesn't seem right. There's clearly an injustice here. How do you guys reconcile that? And how do we reconcile this stuff?
Well, I think the first thing is that everybody's got to do a little bit of hard work. Let's all confess that we're not good at loving our neighbors, even though that's what we're supposed to be doing. My predilection and my natural leaning is not championing those who are a drain on my time and resources. In fact, I want people to tell me why I don't have to care about that. I want people to tell me that folks are just whining and complaining, and if they would just get their acts together, their life would be better like mine. That's easy. Yeah. And I know that that's where all of our hearts lean. So we all need to be honest with the fact that we are sinners who need help going in the other direction.
Yeah, the problem is that our problem is that our hearts do not struggle with not caring about somebody else.
They don't. We don't struggle with that at all.
It's easy. That's our default.
Very easy not to care. Right. So we need to all ask ourselves about our orthopathos, meaning, do I have right feelings when I approach the suffering of my neighbor? Because that's going to influence the conversation. Do you want me? And I've done it before. I can probably defeat you in an argument about this issue. I'm pretty sure. I feel very confident. I don't care who you are. I would love to sit down. I'm starting to feel a little arrogance rise up right now. But I would sit down with Candace Owens. I would sit down with Larry Elder. I would sit down with Ben Shapiro and only Ben Shapiro. I agree with Ben Shapiro on a lot more than I do with the other 2 people I mentioned. Right. But I will have no problem sitting down with you, and I feel fairly confident that we can have at least.
Did you just say you agree with Ben Shapiro? Did you just say you agree with Ben Shapiro?
I agree with him on some things.
Some things, yeah.
Well, let me just be specific so y'all don't run with it.
That's the title of this video.
when he talks about abortion, most of the time, I like him.
That's pretty much.
The moment he starts talking about anything else, I'm like, Benny, let's talk.
Yeah.
But anyways, I would love to sit down with all those guys, and I will sit down with. I've done a live. I had people in my comment section on the live talking crazy. I brought them onto the live. We've talked about these issues. I can show you data. I can show you a study that looked at 25 million traffic stops and then worked in all the variables. And they found one thing that was the major contributor in who got arrested and roughed up: the color of their skin. I can show you that. I can show you all the studies on bias inside hospitals when they took, for example, the medicine thrombolysis. They zoomed in on this particular medication, and they were tracking its usage across all these hospitals, and they found that doctors were showing a bias towards their belief of Black women when they express their pain. We can look at the history of racist ideas, even about Black people in their pain. That there's this idea that is in the medical field right now that our pain is more bearable, that our skin is thicker. 40% of medical students in modern day have this idea that black people can endure more pain than white people. Today, they've done studies on that. And then, I mean, we won't have time for it, but he can talk about how his wife was literally almost killed by a doctor a couple years ago. And it wasn't until our dear white brothers and brother and sister Dave and Mary Seville came into the hospital that they listened to anything that they were talking about. He's trying to advocate for his wife. His wife is trying to advocate for herself. They're saying, you know what, just keep going home. Just go home and deal with the pain. Then my dear white brothers and sisters, they came up to the hospital and said, no, you're going to take care of this right now. Do a CAT scan. Do a CAT scan and find her organs are melting together. And had to take her into immediate surgery to save her life. And there's studies on this that show this is happening all around the nation.
With black women giving birth. I mean,
same thing with birth. I mean, it's, and then they change all the variables. Maybe it's is it the kind of hospital you're at? No, Serena Williams, who is rich and who was well known, almost dies giving birth. Why is this happening? We can look at that. We can look at environmental injustice. I can give you 50 studies showing how companies who are getting rid of their waste, they I forget the phrase for it, but they call them dead zones, where they're pouring their waste onto black and brown communities and almost exclusively. Flint, Michigan is a reflection of what's happening, where people are, and then they're getting sick and they're getting different cancers, all from the environmental thing. I can show you all of that stuff. I can tell you stories about my own life, how I've been harassed. I think we can talk about good cops and bad cops, and we can talk about, you know, you shouldn't have resisted and stuff like that. Nothing replaces the facts that you, in your own body, I'm a rational, college-educated man that is not struggling to interpret his situation. It is clear to me that there's something different about me being black. And I felt it at 6 years old. Before Marx, before CNN or some liberal agenda. The people aren't even thinking.
People in the hood are not necessarily hell bent on watching CNN. They're not reading Karl Marx. They don't know what critical race theory is. They're not, like, the majority of that stuff is not even what's happening. They're just talking about what they have literally
experienced. Right, like, man.
Like even when, I'm sorry, I know that we're going on the rabbit trail, but even when you think about Ferguson, I remember when the whole thing happened with Mike Brown Ferguson and that thing was going on. They were going and interviewing all the people in Ferguson. All the folks in Ferguson were saying, we experienced discrimination from police officers here all the time. And I remember that you had all of the folks, all of these people on the right, like, oh, you guys are just saying this. Everything's police brutality. It's just race card, until the DOJ investigated and said, oh my gosh, the Ferguson Police Department is rife with racism. We have emails, we have text messages, we have empirical evidence showing how they were calling black people monkeys and niggers and all kind of stuff. And these are the police that are patrolling these people. Then we pull the data on the traffic stops and see how there was a disparity in who they were stopping in Ferguson. And then the DOJ said, you guys got to renovate this whole thing.
The Department of Justice.
The Department of Justice.
Who did the same thing to major bank institutions in 2011.
Yeah.
In 2011, the biggest settlement in the history of the United States, paid out in 2011. For what reason, you ask? Thank you. These major banks, I love you, Bank of America. I'm glad that you've changed things because I bank there now. But Bank of America had to pay out millions and millions and millions of dollars because they found that in the system, the Department of Justice, the highest investigation, the highest court here, I mean, not court, but the highest arm of pursuit of justice in our nation, went and found empirical evidence that these banks were actually, when credit was the same, work history was the same, everything was the same. The only difference was color. They were giving either subprime or bad loans, or they were refusing loans. And this happened in 2011. And the point I was making is I can show you all of that, and you can look at it and say, well, what about what Larry Elder said? Or, I'm dumb, I don't really care. Y'all just need to stop. You need to just work harder like I did. You can do all of that in the face of that. And what I'm saying is, and that's what happens more than not. And what I'm saying is what needs to happen is a heart change. You need to open yourself up, so that God can begin to blow the embers of grace on your heart and warm it, so that it would first start with weeping. That even if you think about black on black crime, which I know is a whole nother situation, that we're talking about that and the mythical elements of that and stuff like that. But if you think about black on black crime, do you realize that the victim of that is other human beings? That over 90% of people living in these neighborhoods are non-violent, over 90%. If you even take the inflated numbers that came from the FBI, over 90% of black people will never go to jail. People are not thugs running around killing each other.
There's 42 million of us in the United States.
It's 42 million black folk.
Of them are not committing violence.
And do you care about that little girl in that neighborhood who is enduring the gang violence, which is oftentimes being provided or existing because the economic instability that exists there? Yep. Fatherlessness is a part of the issue, but that's not the whole issue. That's an easy answer.
Yes.
A father can't stop Serena Williams from going to the hospital and dying during birth because she's not believed by a doctor.
Or get pulled over by the police.
It can't. Your father can't stop that. We need to talk about fathers. I am a big proponent of fatherhood. It's a big part of my thing, but that's not the whole story. And if we are to be if we are to be people of the living God, who's the God of the fatherless, then we want to first start by having compassion and weeping. And until that happens, so I say, man, people are being victimized. That the biggest, in your mind, in a lot of folks' mind, the black man is the biggest perpetrator. Like he's the biggest suspect in their mind. But do you not realize that over 90% of the people living in these communities are victims, not just to what's happening outside the community, but what's happening inside the community? Are you advocating for them? No. Or are you only looking for is that guy who was on the nightly news and saying, see, that's what's wrong with their neighborhood? People live in the hood, most of them don't want to be there. That's why they move out and they come off of welfare. There's lots of upward mobility now, and I praise God for that. But man, this is always, and I understand that there are all kinds of liberal pundits who will try to weaponize compassion. You need to have hearts of compassion. And then we start looking at their record. We're like, you don't seem very compassionate yourself. This is not about trying to argue aside. It's simply about what it means to honor Jesus.
Right.
To honor Jesus is to ask God to constantly do the work of sanctifying my heart, that it breaks like his does, because he doesn't have a problem. He doesn't have a problem feeling pain over the death of the wicked, particularly over the death, he has no problem. The Bible says he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. And if that's the case, how much more does he not take pleasure in the suffering of those who are vulnerable? In fact, it's more than that. He actually goes after those people to empower them. And he's supposed to be doing it via our hands. But what happens when, like Ezekiel, he looks in the land, there's not a man to stand in the gap. God looks to his people to stand in the gap for the witness of the nation, that we would be known for people who, at the very least, have hearts that are wide and full of caring about the wounds. Then we'll talk about the practices and the policies. But can we just sit with the wounds?
And the wounds are outside of abortion. It's not just caring about the babies.
Right.
It's kind of
that's good. And I think so what I just gathered from that is when someone then says, hey, Black Lives Matter, or what happened to Breonna Taylor was unjust, or what happened to George Floyd was unjust. They're not looking at the minutia of all the details and, well, did this happen, and was it a no-knock warrant, or did they knock? Well, right? They're saying, hey, look, in light of everything KB just broke down, in light of the implicit bias we see throughout all of society, in all these different factors, the black people don't have the luxury to just sit around and speak of the minutia of the details. We have to just start with a compassionate heart and say, hey, it doesn't take much to realize that things are not equal, and this didn't happen overnight, and you can't just blame the Democratic Party and fatherlessness. You also have to look at mass incarceration. You also have to look at the ramifications of the war on drugs, everything that happened under Reagan, all these different things. They impacted the Jim Crow. All these things connect. But we need to move towards empathy. We need to move towards hearing each other, and I think that's where it starts. And so I just get when I covered the Breonna Taylor settlement recently, right? And I said, hey, there's a $12 million settlement. They created incentives for police officers to live in the communities they serve. They created social workers. They added funds for social workers to go on mental disturbance calls. And there was one more. Oh, I think like an independent board to oversee some of these things, right? And I'm like, listen, these are good things. Like, I don't care where you fall politically, what and they banned no-knock warrants, right? And then people replied with like the minutia of the details. Well, technically her name was on the warrant and technically he shot at them first. And it's like, listen, all of that can be true. However, there is still a massive L at whoever was involved in that situation, and it's not okay. And if she was to blame or whatever, listen, all the charges were dropped against the boyfriend who shot at the police first. That's true. They didn't find any drugs there. And even if she was wrapped up with some ex-boyfriend who listed her address or whatever, even if she was fired, that doesn't change the fact that shouldn't have happened. And if that were a white woman, it probably would not have happened the same way. They probably would have dotted their I's and crossed their T's and been a bit more careful about how they went into that situation. One of the cops was fired by it. And so I just think it's interesting that you guys are speaking macro, you guys are speaking numbers, you guys are speaking big idea, and then people want to go into the minutia and the details of every single case.